I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are sailing across the entire world.
Okay.
You have been on the open ocean for months, you're exhausted, you're starved, and you are driven by this massive, almost mythical expectation.
Right, a total fantasy.
Exactly. You are expecting to arrive in a foreign land and instantly find a towering, powerful Christian empire. You are looking for a legendary king to ally with in a global war. But instead of finding this mythical savior, you stumble headfirst into one of the most profound cases of mistaken identity in recorded history.
The cognitive dissonance is just staggering. I mean, you arrive expecting one very specific geopolitical reality, and the situation on the ground is so utterly foreign that your brain literally cannot process it.
Yeah, it short circuits.
Completely. You end up projecting your own desperate fantasies onto a landscape that has absolutely nothing to do with them.
And that tension, that profound misunderstanding is the core of today's deep dive. We are looking at the incredibly complex, often chaotic history of the Syrian Christians of Kerala, also known as the Nazranis.
Specifically between the years 1498 and 1663.
Right, and our sources for this are meticulously detailed. We're pulling from Portuguese administrative and ecclesiastical records, which are preserved in the Arquivo Nacional de Torre do Tombo in Lisbon, alongside some really fascinating private archives of the Jesuit order.
And these records offer a fascinating, albeit, heavily biased window into a community in transition. They document an ancient, autonomous society that is navigating a massive collision of empires, cultures, and religions.
And the mission of our deep dive today is to figure out how this community managed to survive that collision. We want to see what their specific tactics can teach you and me about adapting in a chaotic world.
It's a survival story.
It really is. Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the arrival of Vasco da Gama's fleet in Calicut in 1498. Now, you probably know the Portuguese were looking for spices, but they were equally obsessed with finding a legendary Eastern Christian king known as Prester John.
Right, the myth of Prester John.
They genuinely believed this mythical monarch was going to help them flank the Islamic powers of the Middle East.
What's fascinating here is the sheer psychological desperation of that initial contact. The Portuguese needed this alliance so badly that they suffered from profound cultural blindness.
Totally blind.
They walked into local Hindu temples, and simply because the structures were places of worship, they mistook them for Christian churches. They looked at intricate sculptures of Hindu deities and just assumed they were unfamiliar, local depictions of Christian saints.
The sources have this highly specific detail that is almost unbelievable. Vasco da Gama's party earnestly got down on their knees and prayed at a local shrine.
Yeah.
But the walls of the shrine were painted with figures that had multiple arms and protruding teeth.
Not your typical European saints.
Not at all. There's a famous quote from one of the travelers, Jonas. He was staring up at these multi-armed figures with fangs, and he justified his prayers by saying that if these were devils, he nonetheless worshipped the true God.
You really have to wonder how long they could keep that delusion going before reality forced their hand. They forced their own religious framework onto the landscape because the alternative was terrifying.
Which was what?
Being entirely alone, surrounded by complex maritime trade networks they didn't understand, and vastly outnumbered.
But the delusion doesn't last forever, because they do eventually find actual Christians. Fast forward a bit to 1502 during Vasco da Gama's second voyage.
Right?
A delegation of actual St. Thomas Christians comes to meet him in the city of Cochin. These are the Nazranis. And they approach the Portuguese asking for an alliance against local Arab merchants and certain Hindu princes who are threatening their trade monopolies.
And the way they introduce themselves is incredible.
Right. They say their traditions go all the way back to St. Thomas the Apostle arriving in India in AD 52.
The Portuguese explorers were astonished. Not only did these people worship Christ, but they had maintained a rich indigenous preservation of their history for a millennium and a half.
It wasn't just dusty books either.
Exactly. They had written records, certainly, but their primary method of preservation was oral and lyrical transmission. They passed down their theology and history through epic songs.
Like the Thomas Rabban Patu.
Yes, and the Margam Kali Patu.
Yeah.
It was a fundamentally different, much more vibrant way of living out their faith than the rigid, text-heavy traditions the Europeans were used to.
And the sheer shock for the European explorers was deeply tied to the Nazranis' social identity. Early writers, guys like Duarte Barbosa and Tomé Pers, they started recording their observations, and they were baffled.
Baffled because it didn't fit their narrative.
Right. They noted that the Nasranis were noble and rich. They were not some marginalized, persecuted minority hiding in the hills. They occupied a very high position in the strict social hierarchy of Malabar.
Standing right alongside the Nebuthri Brahmins and the elite Nayar caste warriors.
They were deeply, seamlessly embedded in the local culture. A Portuguese observer would look at a Nasrani and see someone who was, for all intents and purposes, culturally Indian.
Because they were. They wore the kudumi, which is a traditional lock of hair worn as a clear distinction of high caste.
And the menu, right?
Yes, the minu, a marriage ornament derived straight from local Hindu practices. They functioned within the societal norms of Kerala while maintaining their distinct religious lineage.
But integrating that thoroughly into a highly stratified society comes with significant ethical baggage. You pointed out in your analysis of the ecclesiastical records that there was a darker side to this deep integration.
That is a crucial nuance. Because the Nasranis integrated so thoroughly into the upper echelons of the caste system, Portuguese records show they adopted the local social biases of the time.
Like untouchability.
Exactly. The archives specifically note that they practiced social exclusions, including untouchability, to maintain their elite status. And this actually caused a massive internal debate for the Portuguese Jesuits later on. Well, the Jesuits instituted a policy called accommodatio, which was essentially calculated adaptation. They wanted to allow these high-caste Christians to keep their cultural markers, like the hair locks and marriage ornaments, so they wouldn't lose their valuable social standing.
But I'm guessing there was a catch.
A big one. Simultaneously, the Jesuits wanted to systematically strip away any underlying Eastern theology they deemed heretical.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Their elite social standing wasn't just a matter of cultural respect, it was backed by massive, undeniable economic power. The Nasranis were essentially a heavily armed commonwealth of merchants.
A great way to put it.
While Arab and Mapila merchants controlled the ships and the maritime trade on the coast, the Nasrani Christians held an iron grip on the inland trade of what they called black gold, which was pepper.
They were the undisputed masters of the hinterlands. They were the primary producers, cultivators, and collectors of spices.
They owned the supply chain.
Completely. They controlled the logistical networks, moving the pepper from the dense foothills of the Western Ghats all the way down the river systems to the coastal ports. If you wanted spices to leave India, you had to deal with the Nasranis first.
And that economic dominance was legally locked in by ancient royal grants. The sources specifically highlight the Tharasapali copper plates of AD 825.
Those plates are legendary.
They really are. These physical copper plates granted the Nasrani 72 distinct royal privileges. We are talking about the right to use ceremonial umbrellas, the right to collect specific trade taxes, and crucially, the legal right to maintain a standing army.
And that military capability changes the entire dynamic of the Portuguese arrival. 16th century Portuguese military correspondence is full of a very healthy respect and a good deal of apprehension regarding the Nasrani fighting forces.
They were not to be messed with.
Not at all. The community maintained kalaris, which were rigorous martial arts and military academies similar to those of the local Nayar warriors. They trained their youth from a very early age in fencing, swordsmanship, and eventually the use of advanced firearms.
The Portuguese scribe Antonio de Gouveia went on the record stating that the Nasranis were the best fighters in all Malabar.
High praise from a colonial power.
Definitely. They had elite military preceptors and commanders called panikars. The archives mention specific highly lethal lineages, like the Melita panikars of Mavelikara.
Right.
These commanders were so tactically advanced that they later collaborated with European mercenaries like Eustace de Lannoy to modernize their arsenals and battlefield strategies.
To fully understand this, we have to look at the political context. This military leverage was incredibly unique compared to the European model.
Because in Europe, it was all about the Crusades, right?
Exactly. In Europe during this era, Christian militaries were largely organized for sweeping, religiously motivated crusades. But the Malabar Christians were deeply invested in local geopolitics. They fought in traditional regional Indian wars alongside Hindu warriors to defend their local principalities.
The Swarupims.
Yes, the Swarupims. For instance, the Raja of Kochi relied heavily on thousands of Christian soldiers to fight his brutal ongoing wars against the rival Zamrin of Calicut.
So they were deeply entrenched in the local power struggles.
Which is precisely why the Portuguese didn't just sail in with guns blazing to take over their churches. The Nasranis were simply too heavily armed, too economically vital, and too socially entrenched to be conquered by brute force.
So realizing a frontal assault would be suicidal, the Portuguese pivot. They realized that if they want total control of the pepper trade, they need to eliminate the indigenous middlemen.
They had to get clever.
Right. They shift strategies toward diplomacy and ultimately theological subversion. This brings us to a massive, overarching concept called the Padroado.
The Padroado is so critical to this story.
It wasn't just a religious mission. It was effectively a state-sponsored corporate monopoly. The Portuguese crown essentially convinced the Pope to grant them exclusive franchise rights over every soul, and consequently, every ounce of pepper east of the Cape of Good Hope.
It was a hostile corporate takeover disguised as a spiritual mandate.
But a corporate monopoly on paper doesn't mean much if you don't control the ground level. To actually implement the Padroado, the Portuguese had to systematically dismantle the existing power structure of the Nasranis.
And that structure was dual-layered and highly resilient. The spiritual authority came from bishops, sent all the way from the Patriarch of Babylon, connecting them to the ancient Church of the East.
Right, the Middle Eastern connection.
Exactly. However, the temporal, day-to-day administrative and political power was held by a local indigenous leader known as the Archdeacon.
The Portuguese records refer to the Archdeacon as the Eye of the People, or the Prince of the Christians. He was the primary obstacle to the Portuguese monopoly.
So what did the Portuguese do?
Goa initiates a covert blockade. The Portuguese Navy patrols the Arabian Sea, and whenever a Middle Eastern bishop tries to travel to India to ordain new priests, figures like Mar Jacob, Mar Joseph Salaka, or Mar Abraham, the Portuguese intercept them.
They detain these bishops, hand them over to the Inquisition, or simply ensure they vanish en route.
The goal was to manufacture a leadership vacuum so Goa could install its own compliant Latin prelates.
And this physical blockade of spiritual leaders was paired with a highly sophisticated intellectual attack. In 1586, a Jesuit named Francisco Ros wrote a deeply influential treatise.
Ros was a uniquely gifted linguist, wasn't he?
He was. He actually took the time to master the Syriac language, which allowed him to read the ancient guarded manuscripts of the Nasranis. He used this access to write a document titled De Serum Orientalium Erroribus.
On the errors of the East Syrians.
Exactly.
Ross meticulously catalogs what he defines as theological errors. To understand his argument, think of this theological debate almost like a massive copyright dispute over the exact wording of a software source code.
That's a great analogy.
To the Jesuits, a slight deviation in describing the nature of Christ wasn't just a different cultural translation, it was a total system error they had to eradicate.
For instance, Rose points out that the Nasranis believe in the Kwome, a nuanced Eastern distinction between the divine and human natures of Christ.
He flags that they use the title Christotokos, meaning Mother of Christ,
instead of the Roman Catholic Theotokos, meaning Mother of God. He even heavily criticizes the fact that their traditional Mass, the Korbana, didn't use any physical images or statues.
And while Rotz himself advocated for a gradual educational adaptation, his meticulous cataloging of heresies essentially provided the legal and intellectual blueprint for a total takeover.
His work was picked up by much more aggressive imperial-minded leaders.
Enter the primary enforcer of this hostile takeover. He arrives a few years later in the form of the Archbishop of Goa, Aleixo de Menezes, which brings us to 1599 and the Synod of Diamper.
A dark turning point.
Archbishop Menezes orchestrates this massive, coercive synod to formally crush the autonomy of the St. Thomas Christians. It was a masterclass in bureaucratic suppression.
The ancient metropolitan see of Angamali is downgraded.
They heavily Latinized the Eastern liturgy, forcing it to match the Roman Rite.
And they mandate clerical celibacy for the indigenous priests, known as Cathanars, which completely upended centuries of traditional, integrated family structures within the clergy.
But the most psychologically devastating act of the Synod of Diamper was the systematic destruction of the community's literary heritage. Menezes ordered that all ancient Syriac books, manuscripts, and church records be brought forward.
They were either heavily censored to fit Catholic doctrine, or they were thrown into bonfires.
It was a calculated bibliocide. Destroying a culture's literature isn't just about removing books. It is a psychological weapon designed to sever a community's ties to its own past.
And the sources specifically detail the burning of the Nomo Canon of Abdisho,
which was essentially the legal and canonical framework of the Nasrani community. In a matter of days, the Portuguese attempted to hit delete on centuries of pre-colonial identity.
And that erasure extended beyond texts into the physical environment. The Portuguese engaged in an aggressive campaign of architectural cloaking.
This is wild to me.
It is, Before the Europeans arrived, the churches in Malabar mirrored the local landscape. They look very similar to Hindu temples, featuring hip roofs, beautiful, intricately carved wooden gables, and open-air lamp galleries called Vila Kumadam.
And the Portuguese hated that.
They viewed these structures as pagods, heathen architecture that offended their European sensibilities.
So they literally hid them. They built these massive, imposing Portuguese Baroque and manuline stone facades right over the front of the ancient indigenous churches.
Just wall them right off.
You can still see this jarring architectural collision in places like Angamali and North Paravur today. They forced European statues of saints into the sanctuaries, completely changing the spatial flow and theology of the traditional Qurbana.
They even engaged in renaming campaigns to sanitize the history.
Right.
The cathedral at Angamali had been dedicated to an Eastern saint, Mar Hormizilst. The Portuguese officially renamed it to Saint Hormisdas, the Catholic martyr.
A deliberate move to sever the psychological connection to the East.
It was a total, suffocating assertion of control over the physical, intellectual, and spiritual lives of the Nazranis. But history shows that you can only push a deeply entrenched, highly armed, and socially elite community so far before the pressure causes a catastrophic fracture.
And the fracture finally happens in 1653. The tension has been building for decades and reaches an absolute breaking point.
The powder keg finally goes off.
Exactly. The Nazrani community is furious with the reigning Jesuit bishop Garcia, who has treated them with deep contempt and completely marginalized the indigenous archdeacon. The system is just waiting for a spark.
That spark arrives in 1652 in the form of a new bishop, Mar Ahatullah.
He arrives in India claiming to be sent by the Patriarch of Antioch to lead the community.
However, true to the mechanics of the Padroado, the Portuguese intercept his ship before he can reach the Malabar coast.
They arrest him.
And rumors rapidly spread through the Nazrani communication networks that the Portuguese have either drowned him at sea or handed him over to the flames of the Inquisition in Goa.
And that unverified rumor is the final straw. On January 30th, 1653, at Matanchuri, you have this incredibly vivid, cinematic moment of rebellion.
A Cunan cross oath.
Thousands upon thousands of Nazranis gather outside the church in the sweltering heat. The crowd is so massive, so pressed together, that they cannot all physically reach out and touch the main cross in the courtyard, which is known as the Cunan cross.
So what do?
To ensure every single person is physically and spiritually bound to this moment, they take massive, thick ropes and tie them around the stone cross. The crowd fans out into the streets, holding tight to these ropes like a giant web connecting thousands of angry armed citizens to a single point of defiance. And together, in one voice, they swear a mass, unbreakable oath to never again submit to the authority of the Portuguese Jesuits, whom they derisively called the Paulists.
The historical records from the Portuguese side convey utter shock at the scale of this uprising. The Viceroy of Goa at the time, Dom Philip Mascarenhas, wrote extensively about this event.
He must have been terrified.
He was. He recorded it not as a minor protest, but as an absolute total collapse of Portuguese ecclesiastical authority in the region. 150 years of forced assimilation, bibliocide, and architectural cloaking just violently unraveled in a single afternoon of mass coordinated defiance.
So what does this all mean? Did the Nazranis win? Did they simply kick the Portuguese out and hit the reset button back to the year 1498?
Well, no.
Because history is rarely that clean or simple. The 1653 Cunan Cross Oath was a monumental act of resistance, but it did not result in a happily unified church.
The immense pressure of the colonial era had fundamentally fractured their society.
The community ended up splitting. One faction became the Pazayakur, or the Old Allegiance, who eventually returned to communion with Rome, but successfully demanded to keep their Eastern traditions and liturgy intact.
And the other faction became the Puthankur, the New Allegiance, who broke away entirely and forged a new relationship with the Jacobite Patriarch of Antioch. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the story of the Nazranis between 1498 and 1663 is a profound masterclass in cultural survival.
Truly.
The Portuguese era was undeniably characterized by brutal religious intolerance and calculated cultural erasure. But the sheer weight of that pressure forced the Nazranis to evolve.
They didn't just resist.
No, they utilized the new tools introduced to them, engaging with the printing press to rebuild their literature and navigating new global maritime trade routes to maintain their economic edge.
By the time the Dutch Empire arrived and ousted the Portuguese in 1663, the Nazranis were no longer just an isolated commonwealth of merchants.
They had transformed into a highly complex, multi-denominational cultural mosaic. They survived an overwhelming tide of external information, colonial demands, and cultural overload by fiercely guarding their core identity while simultaneously adapting to a rapidly globalizing world.
It is an unbelievable story of resilience and adaptation, and it brings up something I want you to think about as you step away from this deep dive today.
Yeah.
We spent a lot of time talking about how the Portuguese literally built massive, heavy Baroque facades to hide the ancient indigenous architecture of the Nasrani churches, a calculated process of architectural cloaking designed to make them look acceptable to the outside world.
Right.
Look at your own life, look at your own beliefs, and the way you present yourself in a world that is constantly bombarding you with external cultures, media expectations, and relentless modern pressures. How much of your own identity is a carefully constructed Baroque front? What older, hidden traditions or core beliefs have you cloaked over just to fit in? And have you perhaps completely forgotten you even had them? Something to mull over. We will catch you on the next deep dive.